I've lived beside this creek my whole life, every sunrise, painted gold on its ripples, every summer evening hushed by its lullaby. But one morning, I woke to a concrete wall where water once flowed, an unpermitted dam poured overnight by my own HOA. They'd sealed off my family's lifeline, threatening wetlands, wildlife, and everything downstream. I confronted foremen, battled in a cold courtroom, and uncovered a hidden valve my grandfather installed decades ago. Under cover of darkness, I pried away the concrete, turned that valve, and unleashed a flood of justice. Water crashed through their barrier, sweeping away mixers, wheelbarrows, and their arrogant plan. By dawn, federal inspectors and neighbors stood beside me as the creek ran free again, and our community came together to restore its banks. This is the story of how I fought an overreaching HOA with a torrent of truth and restored more than just a waterway. The pale light of dawn slipped through the tall cottonwoods, painting the creek in silvery hues as I stepped out onto the dew-damp grass. In that stillness, every breath tasted of moss and earth, every ripple a promise of continuity. This winding ribbon of water had carved its way through my family's land long before my grandfather first staked the claim. I moved slowly down the gentle slope, boots sinking into the soft soil, listening to the low hum of cicadas fading out with the night. The air was cool against my skin, mist curling above the surface like drifting ghosts. My gaze followed the creek as it slipped past the orchard, threading beneath the arched wooden footbridge where my daughter used to skip stones. Even now in my mind's eye, I could hear her laughter bouncing off the clapboards of the old barn. It was here where the water glowed translucent in the morning light that I felt most alive, connected to something larger than the boundaries of any map or deed. The world was simple then, water flowed. Crops thrived and the land held its quiet rhythm. I knelt at the bank, running a hand through the cool current. Tiny fish darted among submerged stones, their scales flickering like sparks. A beaver's daughter paddled by, head barely above water, nose twitching as she inspected the bank. Nearby, a family of painted turtles basked on a sun-baked log shells, a mosaic of ochre and jade. In the hush of that moment, I could almost believe this slice of sanctuary would endure forever. But then I saw it, a dull gray ribbon stretching across the channel, stark against the water's mirror. My breath caught. Concrete, fresh, tacky, and all wrong, had been poured in the early hours, sealing off the creek as if it were no more than a gutter in some suburban cul-de-sac. I rose, heart-pounding, boots slapping against stone and earth as I hurried toward the obstruction. My pulse echoed in my ears, thumping like a wild drum. Up close, the work was crude. The concrete was roughly troweled, edges jagged, as though the men who poured it had been in a rush or been amateurs at best. A half-baked label from some generic contractor fluttered on a stake driven into the bank, Greenway Associates 555, 1D2. Whoever they were, they'd done this without warning, without discussion. Sealed my waterway overnight as casually as one might drain a bathtub. I pressed a hand to the cold surface and felt the damp tremor of the creek's struggle against its prison. The water hemmed in bulged on either side, trembling. A few brave droplets seeped through tiny cracks, finding gaps in the fresh cement-like tears in the mouth of a prisoner. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just a violation of my property rights. It was an affront to every living thing downstream. The wetlands beyond the far bank would dry. The cottonwoods would thirst. The family of wood ducks nesting under the footbridge would have no refuge. And all for what? Some ill-conceived attempt by the HOA to improve the stream. Or worse, to exert dominion over land they didn't even own. A low rumble sounded behind me. I whirled to see a white pickup idling at the edge of the orchard. The driver's window rolled down, and a gray-haired man in an orange safety vest peered out. His eyes narrowed like two dark stones. "Morning, neighbor," he called, voice clipped. "We're just doing our job. HOA directive." I clenched my jaw, chest tightening. "Your job," I said, voice low. "You poured concrete over my creek. You stopped all water flow without permission. Who authorized this?" He shrugged as though I'd asked why the sun rose. "HOA board voted. Approved by majority. Environmental survey cleared. You should have been at the meeting last week." A laugh escaped me, sharp, humorless. "I'd like to see that survey." And I'd like to see the meeting minutes that gave you authority to dam up a waterway I've owned since birth. The distant railroad spike of his gaze met mine. He fumbled in his vest pocket and pulled out a flimsy slip of paper on unsigned memo with a hastily scribbled notarization stamp. "Here's your permit," he said, thrusting it forward. "Signed by HOA President. Council says you can negotiate if you want a way through." I grabbed the paper, scanning the text legalese thinner than tissue. No actual signature. No county approval. Just the bolded words, "Property improvement," and "effective immediately." Beneath in red, a single line, "Failure to comply. Subject to fine, lien, or removal at owner's expense." My pulse thundered in my temples. A fine, a lien removal at my expense, meaning they'd bulldoze my bank if I dared to object. The arrogance was staggering. I let the paper fall, eyes returning to the solid gray barrier. I could almost feel the current pressing against the other side, waiting patient, but relentless. "Listen," I said through gritted teeth, "you've made a serious mistake." He nodded as though we were agreeing on the weather. "HOA directive," he repeated. Then he climbed into the truck and nosed off, tires spinning a little in the soft ground. Alone again, I padded back to the creek's edge. The morning sun had gained a few degrees, turning mist to steam. I knelt once more, fingertips brushing the water on the downstream side of the dam. The current formed tiny eddies against the concrete's face, carving a faint channel in the silt. Nature always fights back, I thought. Even from a crack, life finds a way. I leaned in, listening to the distant roll of that trapped water. My chest felt hollow with anger, and then came the surge of something else, determination. This creek was as much a part of me as blood in my veins. If the HOA thought they could override generations of stewardship with a few hours of concrete, they'd underestimated my resolve. And they'd underestimated the power at my fingertips. Behind me, the orchard's shadows stretched and stretched, as though the world itself was bracing for what came next. I closed my eyes, tasting the damp morning air, feeling the heartbeat of the water, and I knew what I had to do. The rumble of diesel engines jarred the morning calm as I trudged back up the bank, adrenaline still humming in my veins. Peering over a low rise, I saw them, two concrete mixer trucks, their barrels churning sluggishly, backed up nose to tail across the channel. Behind them, a trio of workmen in hard hats and neon vests moved with brisk efficiency, shoveling wet cement from wheelbarrows into the gaping formwork. The sight was surreal. In place of the gentle creek I had just revered, there now stood a gray trench of viscous mortar steam, rising from its surface in the chill air. Sunlight glinted off steel rebar and plastic sheeting where the crew had hastily framed the dam. I watched as one of the men, a younger fellow with a stubbled jaw and wary eyes, smoothed the cement's top with a long, straight edge. His movements were precise but impatient, like he knew they were under a deadline, an urgency that faintly disturbed me. My heart tightened. Whatever permit he waved at me earlier, this operation wasn't a casual improvement. It was a premeditated takeover. I strode down the slope, boots crunching on gravel and broken twigs. My shirt dampened with sweat despite the cool air. As I neared the work zone, the younger man glanced up, eyebrows arching in recognition, the pained surprise of someone who'd hoped their actions would go unchallenged. He straightened and beckoned to his foreman, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a gray mustache and a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Boss," the younger man muttered, nodding in my direction. The foreman looked up, lips thinning into a line that was neither greeting nor threat. He took a half step forward, clipboard held at chest level like a shield. "Morning," he said, voice flat. "You're the property owner." I squared my shoulders. "Yes, and you're standing on it without consent." He flipped open the clipboard, revealing a printout of the same hasty HOA property improvement memo. "All approvals in order. HOA board vote, county utilities clearance, environmental waiver." He met my gaze evenly. "We're authorized." I stepped closer so the ground trembled under the truck's idling weight. "Show me that county clearance," I said. "Show me the permit stamped by the Water Management District. Show me any signed documentation that gives you the right to dam the creek." His gaze flicked to the mixer trucks, then back to me. "We've submitted the paperwork. County said it'd process within 30 days. HOA needed immediate action to protect community interests." "Immediate action," I echoed. "By damming the entire waterway. Do you know what downstream farms and wetlands depend on this water?" He shrugged as if I'd spoken in riddles. Your neighbors petitioned. Your creek was eroding the banks. This is a permanent fix. I resisted the urge to laugh. Erosion. The bank's lip was worn only a few inches, smoothed by decades of gentle current. You call sealing a creek with concrete a fix. Before he could answer, the rumble of the mixers grew louder, and with a pointed sweep of his arm, he commanded his crew forward. 2 men hoisted wheelbarrows, brimming with fresh cement, dumping them into the formworks they'd set along the bed. A third poured water from a hose into the mixer barrel, his boot tapping rhythmically as he guided the stream. Plumes of steam rose where hot cement met the cold air, hissing like a wounded serpent. I glanced downstream, where the channel-bent water pooled behind the new barrier, its surface taut and oily. A few timid carp surfaced, gills flaring before retreating. Beyond them, the creek's usual murmur was muted, a suffocated gasp. The scene was grotesque, like seeing a human kneel in a stream of embalming fluid instead of water. My skin prickled with disgust. It wasn't just greed or bureaucracy that drove this, it was a willful trampling of nature's order. If unchecked, every drop of moisture in the channel would be trapped, killing life beyond this point, and diverting the water through whatever pipes or drains the HOA had secretly installed. Worse, if the county later denied their permit, I'd still be stuck with a hardened dam and a bill for its removal. I clenched my fists, knuckles whitening. 1,000 questions swirled. Who paid this crew? What hidden clause in the HOA bylaws granted such sweeping power? How much longer before rare wetland plants began to shrivel? But more than questions, I felt resolve crystallize into action. Inaction was complicity, and complicity wasn't in my nature. I straightened, lifted my chin, and strode forward until I stood shoulder to shoulder with the foreman. The fresh concrete left wet marks on his boots where he'd inadvertently stepped too close to the formwork. He looked down, eyebrows knitting. You need to leave, he said quietly. I don't want trouble. Trouble, I replied, voice calm but cold. You started trouble when you poured this. I swept my arm toward the dam. This is an improvement. It's theft of my water rights and a death sentence for the ecosystem. He met my gaze, jaw clenched. HOA board has final say. Not over water that runs through my property, I retorted. State law protects water rights. That memo means nothing without proper legal backing. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. The trees behind him shifted in a faint breeze, leaves rustling as though echoing my words. He held my stare for a moment, then closed his eyes, exhaling. Look, he said, voice low. I have orders. The HOA wants this done by noon. After that, they'll clear out anything in their way. Noon. The time flashed like a neon warning. It was barely 8 o'clock. 2 hours to cement their barrier fully, and 2 hours for me to stop it. My mind raced. I thought of the valve I'd glimpsed the night before, hidden beneath the site, buried in the wet cement before it hardened. I thought of my old colleague at the water district who owed me a favor. I thought of the county engineer I met years ago at a flood control symposium, a man with a healthy distrust of HOA power plays. But first I needed to halt this crew, stall them, buy time. I looked at the foreman. You're ignoring federal regulations about aquatic habitats. Are you insured for environmental damage? He blinked. That's on the HOA. Then I suggest you stop work until you can prove you are. I pointed at the mixer trucks. Work stoppage knower. I call the State Water Commission and they shut you down. He hesitated, eyes flicking to the truck's engines. They'd likely already paid for fuel and labor. He was caught between a rock and a wet place. We need permits, I pressed, and you need to breach this line so I can inspect the valve. Otherwise, you're responsible for every dead fish downstream. He inhaled, jaw working. Finally, he closed his lips. Fine, he said, voice tight. We'll halt for an hour. No more cement until I get word from my HOA liaison. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I nodded curtly. Thank you. His crew paused mid-pour. The churning drums of the mixers stilled. The foreman tapped at his phone, fingers moving fast. I stepped back, inhaling deeply, watching steam curl into the morning sky. As he spoke in curt tones, I crouched at the dam again, my boots brushing the rough edge of cure-setting cement. If I could pry away just a fragment, I might reach the valve. If I could twist that valve, the flood would break free and render these men's efforts meaningless. But first, time to call my allies. The courthouse lobby felt cavernous and cold, its marble floors gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. My boots echoed with each step as I followed my attorney through a row of steel detectors and past stern-faced deputies. The October chill from outside lingered in the air, seeping through the double doors behind us. Here in this temple of law, I hoped my rights would matter more than the HOA's unchecked ambition. We reached the courtroom, room 4B, a windowless box with rows of wooden benches and a raised dais for the judge. A handful of HOA board members sat huddled on the left, whispering behind stoic expressions. The foreman and his crew were absent. Apparently, the hour's work stoppage had lapsed and they'd retreated. On the right, a scattering of local farmers and conservationists eyed the concrete barriers' printed photos I'd submitted as evidence. My attorney, a woman named Marisol, with steel-rimmed glasses and a reputation for tenacity, leaned in. The HOA's counsel has moved to dismiss based on permit pending, she murmured, tapping her pen against her notepad. But we've shown they violated state water code statutes by acting without approval. We'll argue the preliminary injunction. I nodded, jaw clenched. Every heartbeat thudded in my ears as I recalled the creek's imprisoned water, the tremble against the fresh concrete, the stunned eyes of turtles and fish. All that life waiting for justice in this very room. The bailiff called the session to order. Judge Patel, a stern woman in her 50s with streaks of silver in her bun, peered over her glasses. We're here on the motion of Mr. Finch for an emergency injunction against the HOA Board of Westbrook Estates concerning unauthorized damming of private waterways. Counsel for the HOA, you may proceed. The HOA's attorney, slick, dark-suited man named Rowland, rose. His voice was cool, rehearsed. Your Honor, the HOA properly submitted all necessary documentation to the county, including environmental waivers and board resolutions. They've acted in good faith to address concerns of soil erosion and public safety. The permit is pending only ministerial approval. Issuing an injunction would create irreparable harm to the community infrastructure. Marisol stood shoulder squared. Your Honor, the pending status does not authorize unilateral action. The State Water Code Section 3.14 requires approval before impoundment begins. My client's upstream and downstream water rights are protected by the prior appropriation doctrine. In failing to secure approval, the HOA has inflicted both ecological and property damage. Our evidence shows the flow has been halted for over 36 hours, endangering wetlands and agricultural irrigation. Judge Patel nodded, eyes narrowing. Counsel, do you have documented proof that the HOA acted prior to permit issuance? Marisol slid 3 photo-laden exhibits across the bench, time-stamped images of the creek before and after the pour, and a printout of the unsigned HOA property improvement memo. Rowland's lips pressed thin as he reviewed them. My client's position is that these photographs are inconclusive. As to timing, he countered. The images could reflect preliminary soil compacting, not a full pour. And the memo, while imperfect, indicates HOA intent. He looked at me, expression impassive. Mr. Finch, did you attend the board meeting? He asked. Did you voice your objections when the motion passed? I rose. Your Honor, I wasn't given notice. The HOA failed to send certified letters as required by the bylaws. I learned of the motion only when the trucks arrived. Rowland scoffed. Process was followed. Notices were mailed to all residents. He peered down at his notes. Mr. Finch is your family, the only one affected by this change. Before I could respond, Judge Patel raised a hand. Suffice it. Let's focus on the legal question. Did the HOA violate water code statutes by starting work before permit issuance? Counsel, for the defendant, do you concede they began pouring concrete prior to receiving approval? A tense silence. Rowland's eyes flicked to the courtroom door as if expecting the crew to burst in. He shook his head. Your Honor, we maintain we acted within our rights under HOA authority. Environmental clearance was obtained via expedited review. Judge Patel tapped her gavel. I'll hear from the conservation expert. From the gallery, a bespectacled man in a tweed jacket, rose Dr. Emerson, a wetland ecologist I'd called in. He spoke with quiet authority, describing the creek's role as a riparian corridor, the species dependent on its flow, and the potential for significant ecological harm if water remained impounded. He concluded, without proper review, the concrete structure likely constitutes an unauthorized structure posing immediate risk to the watershed. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marisol seized the moment. Your Honor, the evidence is clear: unauthorized action, immediate environmental harm, substantial likelihood of success on the merits. We request a preliminary injunction to compel the HOA to remove or breach the barrier within 24 hours. Judge Patel leaned back, finger steepled. I will take these arguments under advisement and issue a ruling by the end of business today. She stood. Court is adjourned. Relief and frustration washed over me in equal measure. 2 hours until the ruling, and by then the HOA intended to finish sealing my creek. As the courtroom emptied, I exchanged a tense glance with Marisol. What's our plan if they finish the dam before the injunction? She closed her folder with a snap. We'll file for contempt and emergency relief at the appellate level. But ideally, we stall them physically first. I nodded, determination hardening. The legal avenue was vital, but the valve beneath the concrete wouldn't wait on a judge's ruling. We had to act before the court clock expired. Outside, the October sun slanted across the stone steps, painting them gold. The wind rustled crisp leaves along the walkway. My heartbeat steadied as I inhaled, smelling faint gasoline and justice. This battle would be won in both courtroom and creek bed, and I was ready to fight on both fronts. Word count 1013. The moon hung low and bloated over the pasture, its pale light casting long silver fingers across the damp earth as I crept down toward the creek's edge. The stillness pressed against my ears. No cicadas, no frogs. Even the usual susurrus of wind in the cottonwoods had stilled, as though the world itself held its breath. In the darkness, the concrete dam loomed like a monolith, its surface cold and unyielding. Yet beneath its newly cured face, I knew something waited the valve I'd glimpsed buried in mortar the night before. I carried only a small flashlight and my toolbox, a battered leather satchel holding a chisel, a length of steel pry bar, and a coil of duct tape. Each footstep sank lightly into the mud, leaving shallow indentations that would vanish by morning's first light. My breath puffed small clouds in the chill air as I approached the barrier. In the moonlight, the concrete surface gleamed like bleeding marble, unbroken, except for a rough patch where I'd pried at the edge earlier. I knelt at that spot, fingertips brushing the cured cement. The crack I'd begun had widened ever so slightly overnight, a narrow fissure revealing darkness beneath. I clicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting a pale arc across the surface. Therein, the crack's heart, a circular flange, hid, dappling the concrete with shadow and metal. The valve wheel lay recessed just beneath the barrier's face, its spokes half buried. Heart pounding, I set the light on the bank and opened my satchel. I retrieved the chisel and tapped its tip against the edge of the fissure. Each strike echoed hollowly, the metal's kiss on concrete sounding like distant thunder. Cautiously, I worked the chisel deeper, prying away thin slivers of gray until I could see the valve wheel's outer rim. I swapped for the pry bar, wedging its tapered end into the crack and levering concrete chips free in small pieces. The work was slow, deliberate. Any sudden shift could collapse the opening or collapse the valve itself. A solitary owl called from the ridge above, its haunting cry, a reminder of how widely I was exposed in the night. But I forced my mind back to the task, exposed the wheel enough to grip it, then turn. If I could rotate it, but a quarter turn pressure behind the barrier would surge, sending the concrete packing loose like flotsam. 15 minutes passed before the wheel emerged fully. I brushed away the remaining grit and shone the light across its face. The metal was slick with dampness, etched with rust. Around its bolt-studded hub, the concrete had been pressed close, leaving only a narrow lip for me to grab. I slipped off my glove, pressing my bare fingers to the cold spokes. A shiver ran through me as the metal bit into my skin, but I gripped firmly. Beneath the concrete, the valve shaft descended into darkness, leading to the upstream reservoir. We'd hidden our floodgate installation along a secondary channel decades ago, a maintenance access for my grandfather's irrigation system now repurposed as my counterstrike. I could picture the old plenary valve, sturdy cast iron with a square stem that fit my old adjustable wrench. I clicked off the flashlight and retrieved the wrench from my toolbox. The beam's glow vanished, leaving only pale moonlight and the creak of boards from the nearby footbridge. I slid the adjustable jaws around the valve's square stem. The moment the wrench bit metal, the world seemed to exhale, a faint sigh of air leaking from the pressurized chamber behind the barrier. My heart hammered in my chest. I turned the wrench an eighth of a turn, teeth clicking into the gear. For an instant, nothing happened. Then a tremor traveled through the ground like the creek itself shuddering awake. Water deep below bumped against the valve's edge and hissed as it forced its way past metal. I let go and whispered a silent prayer. The tremor receded, but I wasn't out of the woods yet. The concrete dam had set completely. Its weight would hold until enough hydraulic pressure built behind it. I needed to open the valve further, but slowly to avoid shattering the wheel or dislodging too much concrete at once. I placed the flashlight back on the bank, its beam stationary, so I could work hands-free. Inch by inch, I turned the wrench, each click loosening the valve ring. A distant groan, a sound like aged stone cracking, echoed against the banks. Then another. Tiny fragments fell away, arcing into the dark water below with muffled plinks. Moonlight fell on my face as beads of sweat formed despite the night's chill. With each quarter turn, the pressure behind the dam built, becoming a living thing, hungry, restless. I felt it on my fingertips, a pulsing tug through the wrench. The dam shuddered in answer, hairline cracks radiating outward. Behind me, a dog barked, once some late-night sentinel alerted by my presence. I paused, wrench in hand, body taut as wire. The barking receded as quickly as it came. I swallowed, steeling myself. No second thoughts. Steadying the wrench, I gave the valve one smooth half-turn. Instantly, the sealed channel roared to life. The water, pent and furious, hammered against the weakened concrete waves sloshing in the narrow impoundment. The dam convulsed, dislodging larger chunks in a grinding tide. I stepped back onto firmer ground, wrench in one hand, flashlight in the other, eyes wide. Concrete slabs the size of bricks sheared away, tumbling in a cascade of rubble into the channel. Each slab's fall rang out like a gunshot. The water surged forward, pooling behind the obstruction, before spilling free in a whitewater rush. Splinters of timber and tangled reeds tore loose, swirling in eddies that glinted in the moonlight. I crouched at the bank, watching the torrent carve through the dam's corpse. The once solid mass fractured into ruin, hollowed by water's insistence. I heard the distant rush of the main creek channel welcoming its tributary, felt the shudder of ground as volumes of water rejoined the flow. For a long moment, I didn't breathe. Then the dam collapsed, wholly, a wave of water sweeping down the channel with roaring triumph. It crashed over the footbridge, brushing its support beams, then poured across the orchard's lower terraces, flooding dirt rows, sending mud and water over the stone retaining wall. I stepped aside, boots soaked, as the flood moved on, its glistening arc illuminated by the moon. In its wake lay the rubble of the concrete barrier, piled high like a ruined monument. The water continued cold and clear, reclaiming its channel, singing a jubilant hymn of freedom. I stood there, chest-heaving, wrench still in hand, watching. The night's silence returned, broken only by the creek's joyful roar. In that moment, I understood why my grandfather had loved this land. Because water, when unchained, is both destroyer and healer, cleansing all that obstructs its path. I dropped the wrench into the damp grass and closed my eyes, letting the flood's pulse wash over me. In the darkness, I felt every living thing awaken, the frogs, the fish, the cottonwoods sighing as their roots drank deep. Justice at last had flowed through this land. I tapped out a quick text to Jackson, my old flood control buddy from the county water district, detailing the unauthorized dam and my midnight breach. Then I called Dr. Marisol Chen, the federal water rights specialist I met at that symposium. Her voice had cut through bureaucratic red tape before, and I needed her now. Jackson answered on the second ring, gravelly and half asleep. Riley. "It's 4 a.m. Got a crisis," I whispered, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't scare off any raccoons. HOA poured concrete across my creek. I just cracked the valve and released the flood. They're going to send cleanup crews, claim it as vandalism. I need your help to document the damage and confirm I acted within my water rights. He paused, then sighed. "Meet you at the old county maintenance shed in 20 minutes. Bring your phone for video. I'll have my flow meter and data logger." I hung up and dialed Dr. Chen. Her voicemail invited me to leave a message, so I texted her instead, federal emergency. Private dam removed under water rights law. Need expert witness, ASAP. Seconds later, her return text flashed, on my way. ETA 45. I boxed up my wrench flashlight and phone, then tromped back through the orchard toward the gravel service road. The floodwater had already subsided, some leaving muddy rivulets crisscrossing the lower fields. Orchards I'd planted 20 years ago were waterlogged blossoms strewn across the ground like confetti. But the main channel was free, its water glinted blue-black under the moon racing toward the downstream wetlands. I felt a swell of pride even as I winced at the mess. By the time I eased into Jackson's beat-up pickup, the rotors of a police helicopter droned overhead, its spotlight slicing the trees. The county sheriff was probably circling to see who'd tampered with the creek. I drove the half-mile to the maintenance shed, headlights cutting through a mist that rose off the wet asphalt. Jackson stood under the open bay doors, rain gear and waders on next to a stack of orange safety cones. He waved me in. "Glad you didn't set off the motion sensors," he muttered. His flow meter and a handheld camera sat on a folding table. "We'll need multiple angles: upstream release point, downstream impact zone, and the barrier rubble. Get me timestamps and GPS." I nodded, pulling out my phone. Together we filmed the broken dam from 3 perspectives: the shattered concrete field upstream, the gushing floodwater where it had overpowered the barrier, and the muddy churn downstream where the wash had gouged new banks. I narrated for the camera, citing the exact valve location and time of opening, 17 a.m., while Jackson recorded flow rates and pH readings for signs of sediment shock. "That will hold in court," he said, checking his notes. "Your actions were to enforce water rights, not to damage property willy-nilly. The data shows you maintained controlled release peak flow measured at 80 cubic feet per second below the 120 CCFS emergency threshold." I exhaled. Good. Now we need Marisol's expertise to verify I acted under federal law, not just county code. Jackson grunted and slid behind the wheel as I texted Dr. Chen for her location. 15 minutes later, her black SUV rolled in under the bay lights. She climbed out, pulling her long hair into a tight bun. Her expression was all business. "Show me the breach point," she said, tossing me a rubber-gloved hand. We trooped outside where the orchard was now a patchwork of mud and meandering streams. Jackson handed her the flow meter. She bobbed her head, analyzing the data on its screen. Then she clicked her pen, retrieved a field notebook, and began sketching the original creek bed, the impoundment zone, and the flood arc. "Your breach was surgical," she observed, voice low. "You opened only the valve you discovered, no explosives, no heavy machinery. That points to a rightful remedy under Section 178 of the Federal Navigable Waters Protection Act. Landowners may remove unauthorized obstructions to restore natural flow if they notify the Army Corps and document intent within 24 hours. She flipped through her notes. "I'll draft an affidavit tonight. Also notify the Regional Water Resources Division. They'll hold off enforcement if they see your documentation first." I nodded, relief mingling with exhaustion. "What about the wetlands downstream? I want to make sure they're okay." She stepped over a small side channel, probing the mud with a stick. "Some sediment displacement, but no long-term harm. If anything, a brief surge benefits wetland rejuvenation, clears invasive reeds, and oxygenates the soil. I'll include that in the report." As Dr. Chen worked, Jackson and I loaded her camera with the data files, time-stamped GPS logs, flow rate charts, pH, and turbidity readings. I zipped the satchel closed, feeling the weight of evidence shifting the balance in my favor. By the time the first rays of dawn turned the sky lavender, we had a full dossier, high-resolution video, technical data expert, observations, and a draft affidavit. I emailed everything to Marisol for consolidation with our court filings. Jackson slapped my shoulder. "Your family's creek is safe again. These documents will prove you acted responsibly." He glanced at the shredded dam remains on ashen scar in the orchard. "HOA's cleanup crew will find this a tough job." Dr. Chen packed away her notebook. "I'll file my affidavit first thing. Expect a call from the Corps this afternoon. They might even send someone to inspect." She offered me a tired but triumphant smile. Justice isn't just about breaking concrete. It's about restoring balance. I watched as they climbed back into their vehicles and drove off, headlights receding like tired fireflies. The orchard lay silent, except for the creek's soothing rush and the soft dawn chorus of birds reclaiming the trees. Alone, I stepped to the edge of the waterway and knelt. My reflection was framed by petals and mud eyes, rimmed red with fatigue. I cupped my hands, lifting cold water to my face, then let it spill back. In that splash lay centuries of my family's bond with this land, and a promise that no HOA decree would ever sever it again. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon by mid-afternoon, rolling in like an advancing army. I stood atop the low ridge overlooking the creek's new channel, watching as distant thunder spattered the sky with charcoal strokes. The wind shifted from a playful breeze to a biting gust, rattling the orchard's white blossoms into frenzied flight. My rain slicker did little to keep the fine spray from plastering my hair to my forehead, but I welcomed the chill. It felt like nature's ally in this fight. Below me, the fractured concrete dam lay in splintered ruin, a jagged spine across the waterway. The flood I'd unleashed hours before had carved a deeper bed, and now the channel ran wide and hungry. I descended to the bank boots, squelching in the soft mud, and approached the valve site. Despite the breach, a second control point remained hidden in a grove of sycamores, further upstream, a backup valve that granted finer control over the flow. I had to test it under pressure before the storm truly broke. Storm clouds loomed directly overhead, great anvils of gray sheeting out against the western sun. A distant bolt of lightning forked across the sky, followed by a rumble that rolled through the earth. I crouched beside the valve, its square stem gleaming wetly in the half-light. The maintenance hatch still sat open, its steel door secured by a simple latch, my grandfather's design, meant to allow seasonal flow adjustments. I removed a length of rope I'd tied through the hatch handle the night before, and lowered a small pulley system I'd rigged for emergencies. This would let me crank the valve from the bank if rising water made direct access impossible. But first, a manual test. I clicked the headlamp to my chest harness and slipped my gloved hand onto the wheel. Even in the gloom, I could feel the metal's heft, sturdy, unyielding. I pulled the wheel toward me, turning it a quarter revolution. A low hissing greeted me as air vented from the upstream side. The creek rattled against its banks, unnaturally loud in the gathering storm. I paused, waiting for the valve to bite deeper, then forced another quarter turn. The wheel clicked against resistance, proof that the system still held. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then in fat, insistent drops that pounded the soil like pebbles. The valve's wheel grew slick. I fished a strip of duct tape from my pocket, wrapping it around the spokes to improve my grip. Lightning flared behind me, illuminating the orchard in stark relief. Rows of fruit trees bowed beneath the wind. With the rope slack removed, I attached it to my old hand winch. From my vantage point on the bank, I could slowly crank the valve without wading into the deepening pool. I wrapped my fingers around the winch's handle and turned. Each rotation drew the wheel toward open flow, and I listened for changes downstream. The creek surged forward, heedless of its former barriers, and the water's pulse quickened, thunder in liquid form. A peal of thunder cracked overhead, and rain intensified, driving down in slanted sheets. I pulled my hood up and kept cranking, careful as not to exceed the valve's design. Upstream, the channel's surface grew agitated, rippling with anticipation. I let the winch fall silent for a moment and closed my eyes, tasting metal and earth in the storm. Downstream, the water hit a shallow riffle and exploded into froth. A line of white water raced toward the old footbridge, churning around its supports with enough force to bend iron. I could see splashes lifting against the sycamore trunks, evidence the new flow rate was substantial. Yet, it wasn't a reckless deluge. The channel held it within its banks, welding the creek's old course back to life. Satisfied, I released the winch and rewound the rope around the valve hatch. My fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the raw power thrumming through the system. I unhooked the pulley and secured the hatch door, its latch clicking home. In case of sudden flash floods overnight, the winch assembly would allow me or any emergency crews to throttle the flow without exposing ourselves to the raging current. Lightning forked again, closer this time, and raindrops exploded on the bank. I turned inland, heading back toward the house, slipping between trees slick with rain. Every branch dripped into puddles that rippled as I passed the world alive with sound thunder's drum water's hiss, the wind's chorus through wet leaves. By the time I reached the porch, my boots were 2 inches deep in muddy water. I peeled off the slicker and shook it free, droplets scattering in silver arcs. Inside the wood stove glowed faintly, its embers breathing warmth into the damp air. I grabbed a towel and wiped my face, then moved to the big picture window overlooking the orchard and creek. Outside, the storm was in full fury. Sheets of rain hid the distant ridge, and the creek glowed with phosphorescent currents where lightning struck the water's surface. The flow was steady, no signs of overtopping. The sediment swirl had settled into a translucent brown, but the banks held fast. I exhaled, chest loosening as relief and fatigue mingled. Pouring myself a cup of strong black coffee, I settled into the leather armchair nearby. Steam drifted up in lazy spirals as I stared into the storm. This test proved the creek's channel had been restored and that my control system worked under pressure. The HOA's cleanup team, if they dared approach, would find little more than a functional waterway and a locked hatch. I sipped the coffee, its bitterness a welcome punch. On the windowsill sat my phone notifications, blinking emails from Marisol, confirming court filings, Dr. R. Chen's scanned affidavit, and a message from Jackson with the finalized flow data charts. The legal and technical groundwork was solid. Nature's trial had just concluded successfully. Outside, a final flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the orchard in stark monochrome. I watched a foam line stretch through the creek's course, then recede into darkness. The storm would pass by morning, leaving renewed life in its wake. And when the judge ruled, and even if the HOA appealed, the creek would be free, governed by water's timeless law, rather than concrete edicts. I drained the coffee, set the cup aside, and looked back to the rain-drenched land. In the electric hush, I felt both victor and steward, a homeowner defending heritage, an engineer mastering elemental forces, and a custodian of this living landscape. The storm raged on, but I knew its end would bring clarity, and with it, justice firmly restored. The following morning's pale light revealed the full scale of the upheaval. As I stepped onto the porch, the creek glistened silver beneath drifting mist, its channel remarkably restored. No sign of the concrete dam beyond shattered rubble at its margins. Yet, along the gravel service road, a line of HOA pickup trucks and utility vans stood idle, safety cones arrayed haphazardly around the breach site. Men in neon vests hovered near their vehicles, cameras and clipboards at the ready. I grabbed my raincoat and descended the steps. The air was crisp dew, clinging to my boots. Walking past the last orange cone, I nodded to the foreman from the previous morning, who approached with arms folded and a dour expression. "Mr. Finch," he began, voice tight. "The HOA liaison wants a meeting. We've documented the damage to our project. You're coming downtown at 10. I pointed to Dr. Chen's inspection tags fluttering on a survey stake. "First, you clear the channel. I expect no further obstruction. Second, you remove all machinery and cones. The creek flows freely under both state and federal law." He opened his mouth, then shut it. His crew lingered nearby, glancing at muddy tire tracks and broken concrete. A county inspector's SUV rolled up behind me, its driver stepping out with a water resources badge. He flashed his ID. "Morning," the inspector said, approaching the foreman. "I'm Carter with the Corps Regional Office. We received Dr. Chen's affidavit. Looks like Mr. Finch was within his rights removing that unpermitted structure." The foreman paled. "But the HOA filed for injunction. Ruling on that is pending." Carter interrupted kindly. "But until further notice, no one can rebuild or alter the channel without Corps approval. Under Section 178, Mr. Finch acted as a riparian landowner restoring natural flow." He turned to me. "We'll send a formal notice. Meanwhile, you're compliant." The foreman swallowed. His crew exchanged sheepish looks. I nodded thanks to Carter, then addressed the foreman. "Pack up and go. If you return, you risk contempt." He slumped. "Understood." He waved his men forward. Within minutes, concrete mixers were covered with tarps, wheelbarrows, loaded onto trailers, and trucks rolled away in a dusty line. I turned to Carter. "Thank you for stepping in." He shrugged. "Your documentation was airtight. Good work with Jackson and Dr. Chen." He scribbled a note. I'll fax this to HOA counsel. You might not need Judge Patel's injunction after all. A local reporter from the county paper appeared, camera crew in tow. Mr. Finch, can we get a statement, she asked. I paused, considering. We'd promised Marisol a tight legal strategy. We didn't want sensational headlines undermining our case. Yet transparency would discourage HOA retaliation. I nodded. Standing by the cleared creek, I spoke into her mic. The HOA attempted an illegal dam that would have devastated our watershed. I restored the natural channel under my water rights with expert oversight from federal and county agencies. The creek is safe and the ecosystem will recover. Her cameraman panned across the bubbling water and broken concrete. Any comment from the HOA, I shook my head. They'll have to answer to the core in the courts, not me. As the crew packed up, I walked upstream to inspect the bank. Where timber deck once abutted damp soil, new erosion control mesh installed under Jackson's guidance held soil firmly. Native sedges had been replanted along the margins, their roots already knitting the bank together. Marsh marigolds and sedges would flourish come spring, repairing any scour damage. Returning home, I poured a strong black coffee and sat at my kitchen table. Emails blinked, Judge Patel's clerk confirming she'd reviewed the emergency injunction and held it in abeyance, pending HOA compliance. Marisol's draft motion to dismiss for mootness. Carter's official letter certifying restoration. Dr. Chen's final wetland impact report. I exhaled. The legal front was solid. Now it was time for the HOA meeting. At 10, I drove into town to the community center. The board's table sat under fluorescent lights, members in crisp shirts and polished shoes. I took my seat beside my attorney Marisol and provided copies of the Corps' letter and the wetland report. The HOA president cleared her throat. Mr. Finch, the board regrets the misunderstanding and damage. We propose to compensate you for any orchard losses and collaborate on a sanctioned creek enhancement project. Marisol interjected gently. Mr. Finch's actions were justified. However, a joint restoration plan could benefit all residents, provided it's legally compliant and scientifically guided. I leaned forward. I accept your apology. My priority is ensuring the creek remains free-flowing and healthy. If the HOA funds riparian restoration, bank stabilization, native plantings, wildlife habitat improvements, I'll withdraw any remaining claims. The board exchanged glances. Their faces softened. Agreed, said the president. We'll draft a scope and budget. We shook hands. In that moment, adversaries became partners. Outside the creek gurgled, its course reclaimed. Justice had come not through endless litigation, but by honoring nature's design and shared stewardship. That evening, I stood on the porch as dusk settled. Fireflies winked above the orchard, and the creek's lullaby echoed in the cool air. I sipped tea, thinking of Jackson's data charts, Dr. Chen's keen insights, Marisol's legal acumen, and my own resolve to protect this land. The concrete was gone. In its place, water ran clear, life teemed, and community found common ground. The flood I'd unleashed had washed away more than mortar. It had cleansed old rivalries and revealed a path forward. The sun was just cresting the eastern ridge when I woke to the steady chorus of birdsong, gentle reminder that life endures beyond human quarrels. The orchard lay quiet, each blossom bead-laden from last night's storm, and the creek gurgled softly as it traced its newly carved channel. I stepped onto the back deck, inhaling cool dawn air, scented with wet grass and earth. I carried a thermos of black coffee down to the bank, settling on a mossy boulder where the water lapped rhythmically at my boots. Steam rose from the cup in lazy spirals as I watched the creek's ripples catch the morning light, turning each wavelet into liquid silver. The chaos of the past days, the concrete pour, the midnight breach, the courtroom drama, and the storm's trial already felt distant, like echoes fading into memory. Across the channel, new sedge shoots were unfurling from the mud, their slender blades dancing in the breeze. A pair of wood ducks paddled past, drakes vibrant in green plumage calling to their mates. I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The ecosystem I'd defended was already healing. Nature's own resilience, combined with the intervention of experts and authorities, had ensured this living artery would pulse once more. I sipped from the thermos, the coffee's bitter warmth grounding me. My gaze drifted upstream, where a small cascade tumbled over a mossy ledge, an accidental riffle created when fragments of the dam collapsed. I smiled, recalling how the first shards had shattered under the flood's force. Now in miniature, the riffle lent new oxygen to the water, providing habitat for riffle-dwelling invertebrates and creating shallow pools perfect for juvenile fish. What had been an act of defiance had become an unplanned ecological boon. Finishing my coffee, I rose and followed a narrow game trail between sycamores to the secondary valve site. The hatch door sat closed, the winch and rope neatly coiled as I'd left them. I ran a hand along the wheel frame, now flush with the bank, and felt its reassuring heft. In the light of dawn, it seemed less a symbol of confrontation than of stewardship, a tool for ensuring equilibrium between human need and nature's course. Stepping back toward the house, I paused by the footbridge, where just weeks ago water had been dammed so cruelly. The wooden planks gleamed wetly, and fresh riprap installed under the joint restoration plan cradled the bank. A little plaque suggested by the HOA's restoration committee bore the words, "In partnership, we protect the pulse of our land." I traced the inscription with my fingertip, thinking of how adversaries had become allies, united by shared responsibility. Inside the kitchen, Marisol's draft joint restoration agreement sat on the counter alongside Dr. Chen's final wetland impact report and Jackson's annotated flowchart printouts. I gathered them into a folder and made notes in the margin areas to fine-tune additional bank planting species to consider a cobblestone, low-water crossing for future access. This collaborative plan would soon go before the community for approval, an act of creative diplomacy born from crisis. By mid-morning, neighbors began to wander down the bank, drawn by curiosity and the restored green ribbon of water. Mrs. Patel, from 2 houses down, arrived with a thermos of herbal tea. "I heard the creek's back," she said, eyes bright. "I brought you this." I thanked her, and we sat on the mossy boulder together, listening to the water and sharing our relief. Soon after, the HOA president appeared, accompanied by the county inspector Carter. She wore a well-cut blazer, sleeves rolled up her hands, bearing traces of last night's fieldwork. "Good morning," she said, extending a hand. "I wanted to see the creek by daylight. It looks healthier than ever." "It's remarkable what a little flood can do," I replied with a grin. "And what a lot of cooperation can achieve." She nodded. "We've scheduled the restoration kickoff for next week. I hope you'll lead the planting effort." "I will," I said. "Together." As the morning sun climbed, casting long shadows across the orchard, we walked the length of the creek bank, discussing native willow varieties, buffer width recommendations, and volunteer sign-ups. Every detail felt purposeful, a testament to our collective commitment. That afternoon, as families picnicked on the lawn and children splashed in the shallows under parental watch, I slipped away to the original valve chamber. I opened the hatch and peered inside. The wheel rested at its full open position, steady and secure. I closed the door and locked the latch, confident that the waterway would remain free unless a new threat emerged. Returning to the footbridge, I watched a dragonfly skim the water's surface, its gossamer wings catching the sun. Life had returned in vibrant form, amphibians calling, fish feeding, insects darting. The creek was no longer a conduit for conflict, but a living classroom and sanctuary. That evening, I stood on the porch with my daughter, who'd come home for the weekend. We listened to the creek's lullaby together as dusk painted the sky in shades of rose and violet. She leaned against me and said, "I always knew this place was magical." I put an arm around her shoulders. "It is," I replied. "And now it's a promise for our land, our community, and the generations to come that will protect its magic with as much care as we've shown today." In the soft glow of twilight, the water sparkled and fireflies emerged to dance above the ripples. The concrete bones of the past lay buried beneath new growth and fresh hope. Justice had run its course, but the journey toward stewardship had only just begun. Under the broad sweep of midday sun, I found myself drawn once more to the creek's edge, where the tumult of conflict had given way to the quiet miracle of renewal. Today marked 1 week since the concrete fell, and the channel had already shifted subtly, banks reshaping under gentle currents. I carried a small trowel and a potted plug of stiff golden sedge, intent on reinforcing the spot where the flow had gouged too deep a notch. Reaching the site, I knelt on the mossy bank, brushing away debris to expose bare soil. The scoured channel was shallow but wide, threatening to undercut the adjacent bank in winter's torrents. I dug a modest hole, slid the sedge's tufted roots into the earth, and backfilled with a mix of native gravel and loam. The sedge's arching blades fluttered in the breeze, a small bulwark against erosion. As I worked, footsteps crunched behind me. I looked up to see Grant, my neighbor, from 2 farms, approaching with a grin. In his arms, he carried a dozen slender willows snagged from the county nursery. "Morning, Riley," he called, setting the bundle down. "I heard you needed some repopulation partners." I rose and extended a hand. "Perfect timing," I said. "Let's get these in before the weekend rains." Together we spaced the willows along the bank's eroded curve, each sacrifice branch seeking traction in the moist soil. Grant hammered in biodegradable stakes and tied the saplings upright with jute twine. With every planting, the creek's edge softened a living stitch, mending the scar left by the dam. We paused as a hummingbird darted between flowers, its wings a blur. Grant clapped his hands once. "You know, he said I used to work for that HOA board. I resigned when they greenlit that concrete scheme. Came home and heard what happened. Proud of you, man." I thanked him, heart warmed by the gesture. His words affirmed that the crisis had rippled beyond my property, prompting even insiders to question misguided authority. By afternoon, word had spread of our planting party. A half-dozen neighbors arrived carrying tools and seedlings, dogwood alder and marsh marigold. Children scampered along the bank, their laughter mingling with the creek's murmur. Under the restoration plan, these communal efforts counted toward the HOA's matching contribution, turning a once contentious board into an active partner. I organized the volunteers into small crews, one group planting shrubs along the upper bank, another securing erosion control wattles in the shallows, and a third broadcasting native grass seed across bare patches. Marisol joined with printed maps marking planned contours and planting zones. Dr. Chen oversaw buffer widths and microhabitat placements, ensuring each species fit its niche. As dusk approached, we finished the final willow near the footbridge. Mud-spattered and smiling, we stepped back to admire the living mosaic green shoots lining the banks, ripples dancing over riffles, and the creek glinting like a jewel in the fading light. The HOA president stepped forward, removing her jacket and rolling up her sleeves. "I never thought I'd get mud on my blazer," she laughed. "But this is worth it." I handed her a sapling. "Welcome to stewardship," I replied. In that moment, I saw unity where division once reigned. The creek's pulse had guided us from conflict to collaboration, and now its banks bore testament to our shared commitment. As I packed up my tools, the sky faded to indigo, and stars blinked overhead. Fireflies danced among the willows we'd planted, their lights reflecting in the creek's gentle current. I paused on the bank, listening to the chorus of frogs and the water's lullaby. Each planted sapling, each seeded patch, was a promise that this waterway would remain free-flowing and flourishing. I turned to Grant, Marisol, and the others. "Thank you," I said, voice thick with emotion. "We've done more than restore a creek, we've built community." They echoed my sentiment in smiles and nods. As we dispersed under the starlight, I lingered a moment longer on the bank, tracing the water's path with my eyes. The night air was cool, the world at peace. Tomorrow, I'd check the young plants, reinforce any loose stakes, and update the restoration log. But tonight, I simply stood by the creek, once dammed, now free, and let its steady song remind me why I'd fought so fiercely. Because water, like justice, must flow unhindered. Part 10. Harvest of the Healed Waters. The first light of dawn painted the orchard in pastel hues. As I stepped onto the back deck, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. A faint mist wafted from the creek, its new riffles singing softly as they tumbled over moss-lined stones. Today was the culmination of our restoration efforts, the community's inaugural creek celebration and planting of a commemorative heritage tree, an elegant sycamore grown from seed, collected at my grandfather's birthplace, Stream. I carried the young sapling in its burlap sack down to the footbridge, where a semicircle of neighbors had gathered. Children scampered along the bank, their faces bright with curiosity, while elders leaned on walking sticks, recalling stories of the creek's former path. At the center stood the HOA president, flanked by Marisol and Dr. Chen, each holding a spade. A wooden sign, freshly painted red, Westbrook Waterway, restored in Unity 2026. I knelt beside the sapling's chosen plot, a gentle terrace, overlooking both creek and orchard, and brushed away fallen leaves. The soil here had been amended with compost from our shared garden project, turning clay to rich loam. As I opened the burlap, the sapling's roots radiated like a fine network of hope. The president joined me, slipping her gloves on with a smile. "Shall we?" she asked. Together we lowered the sycamore into its hole, roots spread naturally reaching for the earth's nourishment. Neighbors formed a chain, passing shovels and handfuls of soil covering the roots with gentle strokes. When the mound stood level, children pressed their small hands into the packed soil, patting it down with giggles. I watched as the final handful of mulchwood chips from our trimmed orchard branches was sprinkled around the tree's base, insulating its roots for winter. Marisol tapped a silver watering can and handed it to me. "Let's give it its first drink," she said. I poured water slowly, watching it seep into the soil, bringing the sapling to life. Nearby, Dr. Chen pointed out where wetland plant plugs marsh marigold and water mint had established themselves along the bank. "They'll spread by spring," she noted. "The habitat mosaic is complete." I stepped back, wiping mud from my brow. The assembled group applauded, and the president raised her voice. "Thank you, Riley Finch, for reminding us that stewardship is the highest form of community. May this waterway flow freely for generations." A cheer rose, mingling with the creek's gentle applause. As people drifted to picnic tables laden with baked goods, apple tarts, and pumpkin bread from our harvest festival, I lingered by the new sycamore. Its slender trunk reached skyward, leaves unfurling like green lanterns. In its shadow, I saw the creek's restored channel alive with darting minnows and bobbing ducklings. I wandered downstream to the outer riprap, where the carved riffles still glimmered. Here Grant and a small team had built a low-water crossing, flat stones set flush with the bank, creating a safe passage while allowing fish to swim beneath. A family of frogs basked on one such stone, their skins mottled in autumn brown. I knelt and watched as a juvenile trout slipped past its silvery flank, catching the sun, a living testament to the creek's renewed vitality. The riparian corridor we'd re-established extended beyond my property now. I spotted bright orange flags marking public access trails maintained by the HOA's volunteers. Footbridges over tributary inlets bore plaques honoring local veterans and conservation heroes. At each stop along the creek, interpretive signs explained the natural history, floodplain dynamics, native flora, and sustainable practices. I smiled, realizing this waterway had become more than a natural feature. It was a classroom, a gathering place, and a symbol of shared purpose. Returning to the celebration, I found Jackson under a canopy of cottonwoods, demonstrating the flow meter to curious onlookers. He pointed out how our recorded data had informed the channel's redesign, keeping velocities within safe ecological thresholds. Neighbors scribbled notes, poring over his charts. I nodded in approval, data-driven stewardship, just as my grandfather had emphasized. At noon, the crowd gathered for a ribbon cutting at the footbridge. A long red ribbon stretched across its railing, and the HOA president handed me oversized scissors, an echo of ceremonial moments past. With a deliberate snip, I severed the ribbon, and laughter ensued as children chased the fluttering ends. "We're open," called the president, and people streamed across the bridge, marveling at the restored creek banks and planting installations. I followed them, stepping over smooth stones and waiting just enough to feel the water's cool embrace around my ankles. A hush fell as my daughter approached, her eyes shining. "Dad, this is amazing," she whispered. "I'm proud of you." I knelt and hugged her, her farm boots muddy from exploration. "We did this together," I said, voice thick with emotion. As the afternoon waned into golden light, neighbors shared stories of past springs, when floods gathered unchecked and droughts left banks parched. They spoke of the days before the dam, when the creek had its own rhythms, and of how our collective action had bridged divides. Even the HOA's old guard, now volunteers in rubber boots, joined in the tales, their earlier rigidity softened by hands-in-mud camaraderie. When twilight fell, lanterns were lit along the creek's edge, casting warm pools of light on the water. We gathered around a fire pit near the heritage sycamore, its branches swaying gently. The president raised a toast of cider, and we clinked mugs, acknowledging a journey from conflict to convergence. I gazed at the dancing flames, then into the creek's luminous braid of light reflections. In its winding course, I saw the arc of our community's evolution from concrete divide to ecological unity. The water flowed on unobstructed, a living reminder that true stewardship honors both the rule of law and the law of nature. As embers glowed, I placed a hand on the sycamore's trunk, its bark cool under my palm. Here I murmured, "We remember that justice and care must flow together." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves like an answering nod. Under starlit skies and the sycamore's slender canopy, our celebration felt like a promise fulfilled and the beginning of a legacy. The creek would chart its own path now, guided by the community's collective will to protect and preserve. And I, as both homeowner and steward, would forever stand guard at its banks, ready to let nature and justice flow unhindered.